All right, so welcome to the Right to Publish webinar on presenting and integrating evidence. We're going to be talking about a number of things today related to evidence. One is types of evidence. It should be Whitford too, Kellogg and Whitford example of an article where they have different types of evidence, textual evidence, charts and data that they've been able to bring together and integrate. And they do a great job of doing that. So I want to bring that forward as an example. Belcher's writing advice for writing up evidence. We'll take a look again at Wendy Belcher's work and picturing your evidence. What does it look like? Kind of how is it that you're picturing it? We're not going to go into illustration or so many of you, by the way, and particularly if you're in science fields where you do a lot of detailed kind of graphing or kind of illustration of your processes or data. We're not going to go into that, but just kind of for you thinking about it. And then talk a little bit about paraphrase and summary if we have time, and then the Canvas course. All right. So this assignment for this week, and again, we're not going, you can turn things in when you get to them. So it doesn't matter. You can just do it as you need to. But it's set up a summary of an assessment and plan for how it is that you identify an article and text, right? You assess its integration, you plan the revisions, and you work it, meaning that you're looking at, based on what we have a conversation about today, a place where you have integrated a source, maybe a portion of your literature review, maybe a portion of your discussion, and that you're looking at how it is that you've integrated evidence or ideas from other folks. And is it working? Is it smooth? Is it how you want it to be? If it is, you're like, yes, this is great. And then you have to describe, why it's fabulous. And then your planned revisions are probably nothing if it's already fabulous. But if you're looking at it and you're like, this is not flowing the way that I want it to, what are those revisions? Kind of how is it that you're going to work that? All right. So just a reminder, and we talk about this repeatedly through CSU Writes. So the repetition here is for a purpose, though. Just as a reminder that writing is really complex. It's both the product, but also the process, putting things together, the craft of it, the arrangement of it, the practice for you, how it is you're customarily kind of habitually doing this. What are your rituals for writing? The project, anything that's moving it forward. So some of you are in project stages where you are not necessarily writing out your article, but you're looking and planning and what it will be like to write that article. And it's also kind of who you are in relation to the work that you're doing. Today's session is really focusing on that process and that kind of craft of it. How is it that you're arranging things on the page so that your reader can engage with your ideas, largely in relation to the data that backs up your ideas or the evidence that shows what it is that you've done, or the other folks who are in conversation with you. There are multiple types of evidence. And so when we talk about evidence, depending on your field, you might be working with something that is qualitative in nature. It could be data that's collected in the field. It could be direct observation, interviews, documents of behavior. But it could also be, of course, many of us are at CSU because we're a highly STEM institution, working with quantitative data or some sort of mixed grouping of it, which is data collected using standardized instruments that yield measures or statistical information that would be put into graphs or figures or other things like that, oftentimes, so that that image, that illustration, that picture that's worth 1,000 words, right, can help demonstrate kind of the value of those numbers. You can also, though, have historical data, which is the kind of broader context sometimes for certain types of discussions, particularly in the social sciences and in the humanities. And those are things that show, they're usually primary documents, and they show time, kind of where the period itself, relationships between folks that might be notable or unnotable, right, in the past, but you're going to bring to surface and share their experiences and conversations via letters or something like that, or kind of the events of the day that there are public records for, or even institutional records or something like that. You can have geographic data and evidence. That's something that's through looking at space and environment. So you can think about maps or cartography for geographic data. Textual data, this is my field. So what I work with is textual evidence. It's collected from novels or other texts, or sometimes now that I've moved it more into writing studies, what it is that writers are writing about. But it could be diaries and novels, poems. I love the ship's logs if you think about where it is that people have been going, histories, sacred books, etc. And then you can also have artistic evidence. And so if you're looking at, depending on your field, looking at a painting as an evidence, it's evidentiary of something, you can write about that, do an analysis, images, paintings, write photographs, sculptures, etc. All right, so this is the article though that I want to use as an example for us to start looking at how it is that any number of types of evidence can be integrated. This one, however, is in a specific field. It's in the field of education and psychology, and so it's a social science article. It is from the early-ish mid 2000s. Let's see, I'm trying to remember the date. 2009. There we go. And they're talking about writing skills and making a case for deliberate practice with undergraduates. So in order to make this case, they're going to be looking for certain types of evidence that are going to back up. They're saying that deliberate practice needs to be something that is integrated into undergraduate courses and teaching. And so this is the abstract, so you can kind of get a big picture and a reminder of what this article is about. And we talked about this earlier, I think when we did the abstract one, when we were talking about how unusual it is to have like something cited in your abstract. That's not typical, but here they did that for a very specific reason. So I'm just going to read through the abstract so you can get a sense of what's going on big picture in the article when we go to some of the evidence that they're bringing forward. So the development of advanced writing skills has been neglected in schools of the United States, with even some college graduates lacking the level of ability required in the workplace. And so this is coming from the National Commission on Writing, and it comes from multiple reports. And so they want to kind of ground that. They're not just saying that on its own. There's a national commission behind that, the federal commission, right? The core problem, we argue, is an insufficient degree of appropriate task practice distributed throughout the secondary and higher education curriculum. We draw on the power of the law of acquisition, the role of deliberate practice and expert performance, and the uniquely intensive demands that advanced written composition place on working memory to make this case. A major impediment to assigning enough writing tasks is the time and effort involved in grading papers to provide feedback. We close by considering possible solutions to the grading problem. So notice where they go. They go from talking about and setting up kind of this big picture that there's a problem, right, in the US with graduates lacking the ability required in the workplace, right? And so that they're not being trained well enough in writing. The core problem, they say, is task practice distributed throughout the curriculum. And there are ways that they identify that task practice as being tied to acquisition and role of deliberate practice and performance. And then here, what's interesting is they wind up someplace where you might not automatically expect, because they go not necessarily to the individual student, or do they go back to the kind of broader distributed through the higher education curriculum, but they go specifically then to classroom and a grading problem, and talking about how over time, right, it's the task of giving feedback on individual assignments across that curriculum means that there's a grading problem. So this is the kind of identify where the bottleneck is. So they're going to go from kind of big picture writing into something very specific with how it is that skills are developed, and then they're going to go towards a grading problem. So that's a lot to take on in an article. So let's see how it is that they integrate some evidence and kind of set up what it is that they're talking about, what other people have said, and what it is that they say. All right. Oh, I already talked about that. So one of the places you can go for evidence, of course, in this case, it's anecdotal reports. They tell us that they're biographies of other writers to be able to talk about the nature of feedback, the nature of how it is that they practice. So we are moving from someplace of the realm of just talking about assessment really into how it is that writers write and how it is that they practice. And so they take it to professional writers so that they can and say what it is that professional writers have done. All right, so anecdotal reports of professional writers corroborate the view that intense practice over periods of years is critical to success. For example, Joyce Carol Oates deliberately practiced as a college student by writing a novel in longhand, then turning the pages over and writing another novel on the flip side. Both novels would then be tossed in the trash. Since high school, she began she's consciously training myself by writing a novel after novel and always throwing them out when I completed them. Norman Mailer also credited his eventual success as a writer to self-motivated practice. I think from the time I was 17, I had no large desire than life to be a writer. And I learned to write by writing. As I once calculated, I must have written more than 500,000 words before I came to The Naked and the Dead. All right. So it reads pretty smoothly, right? We've got these anecdotal reports, and then we've got this example. The extended example that is paraphrased comes from Joyce Carol Oates' biography. And then after that, it moves very similar to another example. So these are examples of anecdotal reports. So that anecdotal reports of professional writers corroborate the view. So we have not just one report, we have two reports, this idea. And then we also have the existence of their kind of quotations that are integrated, as well as the sources for that and the dates for that. So whatever the citation format is that you have, that's always going to be the case, and it'll be the thing that gives credibility to your text, that you didn't just make it up. But notice that it just reads kind of pretty smoothly from one thing to the next. And so I like how that's integrated there, right? For example, it moves pretty easily. And then when we move to Norman Mailer also. Notice that the terms that connect ideas are pretty subtle. There's for example, we use that one a lot. But note where also is in this Norman Mailer 2002 also credited his eventual success. So it's built on, and the paragraph continues to include a longer quotation from Norman Mailer. And so the only thing that's holding those together for us as readers, because Joyce Carol Oates and Norman Mailer are not the same people, right? Not the same writers, is that the word also is there, but it's really smooth, just kind of flows easily. So when you're selecting, and by the way, think about how much Joyce Carol Oates has written, right? Both Norman Mailer and Joyce Carol Oates in their biographies. That's a lot of text, and they pulled out something very specific, right? You've got a quotation, you've got a paraphrase. So Belcher reminds us, be choosy. Use only the results that relate to your argument hypothesis, which means avoid data dumping. If you've ever had the impulse to just show how much you know, give them everything and then explain only a little, then just know that you don't have to give them everything. You just have to describe what you're talking about, what your point is, give them the evidence that's most relevant, and then describe why that's important or how it's connected. Using tables and graphs, what they can do is standardize and present complex information. For those of you who are in the hard sciences, I think that you just automatically do that now. In fact, most people you create your tables, your graphs, or your figures in advance of writing sections oftentimes, because it gives you such a placeholder for being able to describe what it is that you're writing about in your results. Use figure table graphs only if the data is complex. So if you can summarize it in a sentence or two, you probably don't need to create a figure or use that space for an image. Design them well and title them properly. I think that that's a skill. The designing well is something that you come to gradually with feedback and advice from advisors and people who are in your field. The titling properly, you just follow your formatting instructions from your field guides, your disciplinary guides. Organizing results thematically. This goes back to the conversation that we had last week or the week before on how we arrange according to an internal logic. We can arrange things chronologically, we can arrange them spatially, but more often than not in our academic writing, we arrange things thematically, and that there might be this kind of internal order and that makes the theme work. So if you think about like first this, then that, why would it go in that order, right? First, second, third. Why would you put things in that order? Usually there's some sort of internal logic that are we going from something that's already known to something that's more familiar or less familiar? Are we going to something that is kind of a bigger picture to something that's more narrow? There's usually something internally that's helping you arrange that thematically. If you can organize the results around your argument, that is super helpful. And this goes to what I think Ashley was saying earlier about that kind of alignment or integration of ideas, and realizing that sometimes what you've drafted out earlier on about shaping your argument, giving background to your argument or the point that you're making, by the time you get to your results or someplace later on in your document, you might realize that, oh, wait, there's some things here that are more detailed and I need to set them up earlier on, or I need to go back and make sure that it's clear that this is where we're going. So I want to talk about some of the results that Kellogg and Whitford bring forward in their document. They pull a table. It's not their own original research. This is evidence from elsewhere. It's from a national survey of student engagement and from that annual report. Notice it's reprinted with permission, right? And what they do is they look at the frequency of assignments of various lengths of first year and senior college students. So they've got this kind of breadth of the undergraduate experience that they're looking at. So first year and senior, and looking to see how many pages were written and or assigned, excuse me, and then number of papers that were written. So you have the first year versus senior. We no longer use the term senior, I think, but I'm not sure. So that 20 pages or more, 15 to 19 page or 5 to 19 pages, all right, and then fewer than 5 pages. And what are the percentages of how many of those that are assigned? And what you see is that for the most part, as you move through the undergraduate experience, at least what they're showing in the National Survey of Student Engagement, is that there are certain places where you have, it's less likely that your first year experience is going to include a paper where you're required to write 20 pages or more. But by the time that you reach your kind of fourth year, kind of finishing up, that you might be, more than likely, maybe your capstone project, there are other things. Sorry about that, folks. Might be much more common, right? That you would be asked to write something that is 20 pages or more. But also look like those are, the numbers of papers that you would have to write that are assigned that are fewer than 5 pages in your first year, much more extensive, right? But that if you look at the numbers, and I don't know that this is true anymore. This is data that's almost 20 years old, by the way. I suspect that it's significantly changed. But that somewhere in this kind of middle space, you see the number of pages where first year and senior writers, 5 to 10 assignments of 5 to 19 pages. I would bet that a lot of 5-page articles or essays are required from students. All right. So let's see how they wrote about this. You heard me kind of like trying to take you through and show you some of this out of context. What you really need, and you picture your reader coming across a table like this, they too want to be able to make sense of it, right? How many papers are written or assigned, and then what are the pages, so the length of those papers. And this is how they ground it and how they describe it. Note, they're going to be pulling out select details out of that context, and it's going to lend itself to the existing argument about deliberate practice and the need for giving feedback, right? So they're going to take it to how is it that basically teachers at some point can score all of this. So the table 1, the means provided in table 1 reflect overall averages. And I think I have these highlighted someplace. Yep. So table 1 reflect the overall averages, but it should be noted that there was some variation across different types of institutions of higher education. Notice that some variation across different types of institutions in higher education was not included in that table. So this is something that they chose to bring forward and integrate after the fact. So they're giving us that in writing. It's important because if you're reading this and you're thinking, well, that's not true of my institution, then they've already covered that for you and saying, well, it's not going to be all institutions. It appears that most of the written work assigned in college requires fewer than 20 pages in length. As shown in Table 1, 83% of the first year and even 51% of senior students were never given an assignment that requires 20 or more pages. Specific majors revealed some fluctuation. All right. So what you see is that most of the work written, assigned, right, in college, so they give us a description of what that is. They point our eye to some very clear numbers in the table. And then they say specific majors revealed some fluctuation around these overall averages. All right, so that we also know, just like we did with the types of institutions, that there's some variation. They also note that there's going to be some change among majors. So you might think that, for example, a math major might be unlikely to be, assigned a 20-page article to write or, essay to write. But that if you're an English, senior in English, you might be assigned a 20-page paper to write. For example, 62% of seniors in the physical sciences never composed a paper of 20 pages or more, whereas only 45% in social sciences and 39% in engineering had not composed at least one extended paper. A small but troubling percent of first-year students, 15%, and seniors, 9%, never composed a paper of 5 to 19 pages in length. When large numbers of papers were assigned, 11 to 20 or more than in 20, they were typically fewer than 5 pages in length for both freshmen and seniors. On a somewhat positive note, some of the data indicate that more lengthy and complex texts are being assigned to seniors in their major and minor areas. Okay, so you can kind of see where it is that they're taking us in describing kind of key features of that table. You can also see their argument at work and how it is that they're describing and integrating this information. So some of their terms are clear. This is just kind of neutral. That table 1 reflects something. This is a neutral statement, right? It reflects something. But here, I guess we could go even with appears. Appears is a little hedgy, but it also seems like, that they're saying, based on this report, most of the written work assigned revealed some sort of fluctuation. And then by the time we get down here, small but troubling percentage, as soon as we hit troubling, now we know that there's something at work in what it is that they're thinking and going to be arguing for about the amount that needs to be assigned at some point, the amount that students need to hear is be given feedback on. And then also that they indicate a somewhat more positive note. So they're giving us very clearly where it is that they stand in their interpretation of this information from the table. So when you're working through it depends on your field, by the way. For some fields, you want to have your findings, and your findings are going to be distinctly separate in a separate section from your discussion, at which point in time you're going to keep that much more separate. But if you're allowed to integrate your own findings here, this is, some findings from another report, but you're able to, if you're able to integrate them, then you can have this kind of lovely place where you have discussion and conversation about what it is that you're seeing and why it's important. All right, so this notion of organizing your results around an argument, this is not to say that you need to go back and like we talked about in our prior conversation. This is not about redoing your hypothesis or doing anything unethical. This is making sure that there's an integration from your argument to your results. And sometimes it's best for those of you who do start with figures or data. That's one of the ways that you can start describing that, and then you can work your way into the larger argument that you're writing, which means if you're doing that, you're generally starting with something like your methods, because you've already kind of drafted or written that part out. By then you've got your data and you've got your findings, and you start to craft that, and you start to do your analysis and start writing what it is that you have found, your findings in your discussion, perhaps. And you can go back to that introduction. Some of you might be working, however, with faculty who have a very different notion of how you write an article or a chapter, and that you start from the introduction, and that you need to craft out your introduction and know where it is that you're going more broadly, also introducing the literature, the field, and kind of crafting that before you get to inserting and talking about what it is that you have found. So if you think about, there's a couple different approaches. Depends, you follow your faculty advisor's guide always. But then also know that it may be that you want to be able to go back and forth a little bit more and adjust as you're writing it out. But here, this is a good example of kind of organizing your results around your arguments. So for example, if you're asking whether identity is a function of variable A, B, or C, organize your result sections around A, B, and then C. What you want is this kind of consistency of arrangement from your introduction throughout. And as we talked about before, maybe you've changed the order, changed how you've been writing about things later on. So you want to go back and you want to make sure that you then revise and make sure that variable A, B, C is in order and A, B, and C is in order. It'll just make it easier for your readers as they move through your article. All right, so here's some additional advice for interpreting ideas and evidence from those sources. Again, quote meaningfully, don't quote when you can paraphrase. And this is important because quotations take up visually a certain amount of real estate on the eye. So you want to make sure that if you're going to break up how it is that readers are reading, that you break it up well, that it's seamlessly kind of and necessarily quoted. So we can think back to the Joyce Carol Oates piece, for example. Summarize briefly. So just make sure that if you are pulling together and you're summarizing what one report or one set of authors said, that you can do it in just enough space to give your readers enough to know so that they can understand your arguments and your points. Select only a few parts for analysis, meaning that if you have that table, for example, you're pointing your reader's eye to very specifically what is there. The table that was included here was from a larger report, and so it was something that they are drawing on only for those parts for analysis. For example, referencing the larger picture. So going back and identifying, you can think about where in their description of the data in the table and what was relevant, they kind of, what was troubling about that, what was on a positive note. Those are references to the larger picture. Limiting notes, meaning endnotes or footnotes, depends on your field. Some fields use a lot of endnotes, like history, for example. There's a lot of conversation that happens through endnotes. In my field, it becomes much more limited. And in some fields, it's hardly done at all. And you might have appendices. You might have other things that you use. But if you are interpreting ideas, you don't want it to have all of that buried in endnotes or footnotes. It's kind of the point. Avoid discussing intentionality. Depending on your topic, for many of you, this will not be an issue unless you're working with human subjects or you're writing about what other people have said. Where intentionality becomes important is if you're describing what another author who's written about the same topic as you has said about that topic, and then let's say the quotation doesn't really say what it is that you think that they were going for. If you reframe it and you say something about what they really meant or what they really intended to say. By the way, we hear this a lot with political figures, for example. Well, they might not have said that, but what they really meant was. You can't do that in academic writing. We can do that in culture. We can do interpretations of what it is that we think that other people have meant by their language. But when you're writing in academic, kind of scholarly research ways, you have to go with what's there on the page and what it is that you know that it means. And if you have to try and mind read someone else, it means that you're doing the work that they should have done in their analysis, but perhaps they didn't. There is something that you can think of that is about filling holes, for example. And if we go back and think about the example we just went through with the table, you have the context that was not part of the table previously shown, but we know that because Kellogg and Whitford read the report, that they're saying, this was, only this group of folks, or it was only from these kind of areas, and the data is limited, or the study includes, but it's a kind of different disciplines, for example, or across these disciplines. Not all disciplines had exactly the same numbers. But that's not intentionality. They're just telling you what was missing to be able to fill in the hole. If you're mind reading somebody, just know that you're trying to share what they intended, and don't do that. If you are in a field where you are interpreting a statement But you're tempted to go for the political statements. And I don't know that anybody in here is in those fields, but just go for nuance. What is it that's being said that has an impact in these ways on the field or on another person? So keep it grounded. And if it's too easy to go sometimes for the political insight. So avoid politicizing. All right, we're going to go back to this, and I want to kind of reshare and thinking about those introductory statements and how things got integrated. The anecdotal reports. Notice here that the very specific type of evidence is listed. So these anecdotal reports of professional writers. It's important for them to identify that they're professional writers. It's also important for them to identify anecdotal. It's less the report and less the professional that give this credibility. It's actually more that we know that this is coming from someplace anecdotal. So it's clear what type of information is here, what's going to follow. And that's all I wanted to say on that one. So some working definitions and things that might be helpful. If you remember, summary takes something that's much larger and kind of condenses it. We have different types of summary that we can do in abstracts, for example, but it's a synopsis. It can also be called a brief. A summary can be called a finding. Summary can also be called a report. It could be called a priest. It can also be an abstract. So that kind of short overview as a summary includes these kind of main points. What are the kind of main things that we need to know that's kind of extracted out? It's not the same thing, however, as a paraphrase. Paraphrase is where you think about it even much smaller. It's a rewording of a statement, something that's very specific within that document or within that kind of dialogue or whatever it is that you're quoting from, right? So here you're restating, you're rephrasing, and you're using your own words. You want to make sure that you are completely accurate, though, in what it is that you're restating. And if there's a chance that you will misrepresent by paraphrasing whatever that main idea is, whatever the point was that someone made, then just make sure that you quote, right? It's better to quote and have it be clear and have it be accurate than to risk paraphrasing and then represent inaccurately. That quotation, as we know, is a direct repetition of those words. Sometimes it's called an excerpt, a selection, a reference, kinds of things, but they're identified and signaled by quotation marks. So again, visually, they take up a little bit more space on the page by including quotation marks. But when in doubt, quote. And all of the above, summary, paraphrase, and quotation need to be cited according to your field conventions. Some terms that might also be helpful. Many of you may have already heard of something like the quote sandwich or the ICE method. This is where your quotation goes between however it is that you're talking about it. When they say introduction, it's introduction to the relevance of the information. So why is it important that you're going to be talking about this? And then your explanation or analysis of that. So thinking about the anecdotal reports of professional writers, right? Suggest blah, blah, blah. That's their Kellogg and Whitford's introduction. And then they give us the details and the evidence after that of what comes from those anecdotal reports. And then you just kind of explain the quotations. You've got to explain the material. I didn't include all of their further explanation of that connection to deliberate practice, but it continues on. Patch writing is something that you don't want to do. It's helpful for you to know about because it's a temptation. And that may be where you kind of quilt sources together in such a way that it overshadows your own research. You're like, well, so-and-so said it best. And they said, if you ever tempted to like give over your writing or argument to somebody who said it better to you than you, just know that just stop and kind of figure out what's your voice? How is it that you can say what it is that you need to say and write about your own research, your own thesis, your own analysis? And that quilting together in kind of the patch writing, it can also lend itself towards plagiarism if you're also not careful. So just don't do it. So there's a visual, and this is super, super common. We use it in all kind of argumentation type courses. But we've talked about in the past, they say versus I say. They say this, I say that. So what is it that you are pulling from your literature? What do they say about this topic in this field? What do you say then? What do I say, right? In response to that, in connection or relationship to that. When you're working with evidence and integrating it, it's just really helpful for you to kind of add the I say first. I introduce it. This is what they say, and then this is why it's important, and you describe it. A couple things about other evidence that you might be able to use in your writing. Oftentimes, common knowledge comes up, and broadly speaking, that's something that people commonly know and you do not have to cite. So it's something that an educated reader would reliably know without having to look it up. Note that common knowledge shifts based on your readership. You are writing for expert readers, right? People who are experts in the field. And so that changes a little bit of what you can take for granted. Early stages, it can be really hard to figure out what do you write about and what do you keep on your own, right? Or what do you have to explain? How's that? So common knowledge includes information that most people would know, like 32 degrees Fahrenheit is when water freezes, or that Barack Obama was the first African-American mixed race president. It could be information, however, that's shared by a cultural national group, right? About famous heroes or events. In the United States, we kind of take for granted, 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, for example. But it could also then, as I mentioned about expert fields, it can be knowledge that's shared by members, right? Such that, the diffraction of radiation of wavelength from a crystalline solid is a given by Bragg's law. Maybe that's something, for Bragg's law is something that in your field you just take for granted. You don't have to go back and cite the original source for Bragg's law. You just talk about as Bragg's law. So those are some of the things as you move towards the expert in your area, it becomes a little bit trickier if you're new to the field to figure out what do you really need to cite and what can you just take for granted. But if you're ever in doubt, just always cite. So you can ask yourself, who's your audience? Who's going to be reading this? What can you assume that they already know? And will you be asked where it is that you obtained that information? The last one's kind of crucial. I think that's the one that helps you identify what your readers actually need to know. Will you be asked about it? And will they need to know more about that, And I'm going to just kind of move through this pretty quickly, but thinking about Asperger's syndrome, that you might need to cite it if you are in kind of a lower level undergraduate course and define it. But if you are a graduate student in psychology or publishing, you're not going to have to give out, and cite where it is that you got the symptoms for Asperger's syndrome. Or fair value accounting, right? How it will be understood by a group of economists, but would need citation by non-experts. This one here, a statement reporting that 24% of children under the age of 18 live in households headed by single mothers. That would need to be cited no matter what. And that's because it includes 24%, right, under the age of 18. Where did this figure come from? Where did this information come from? All right. And the best advice, when in doubt, cite, as always. I pulled this, by the way, from Academic Integrity at MIT, some colleagues over there. Another couple of just thoughts on plagiarism, just because it comes up with citing sources, is knowing that, plagiarism is submitting somebody else's work as your own work if it's previously been published or submitted someplace else. Paying somebody else to write your paper, patch writing, which, by the way, this paying someone else to write your paper is now an issue, of course, with ChatGPT. So making sure that if you're using AI, that you're disclosing how it is that you're using AI, making sure that's clear. Not using quotation marks, failing to cite sources, copying, not crediting figures, tables, image, pictures, or other data. If you're in computer science, for example, and you're kind of pulling figures, that's really common in that field, don't do it. If you're pulling code, really common, don't do it. You always have to make sure that you're giving credit where credit is due. The Office of Research Integrity, this is on the Canvas site. Roig has this guide for plagiarism. If you're all concerned and thinking that you might be somehow not paraphrasing correctly or not summarizing correctly. Take a look at the plagiarism guide from the Office of Research Integrity from our Government for Health and Human Sciences. Super helpful. Because the consequences are, of course, your professional reputation. You don't get to build the skills that you would want to by working through this stuff and the various ways of that kind of practice and process. You can lose funding. Research misconduct is expensive. In fact, there was a big piece in Chronicle today about additional research articles having to be retracted. It can affect the quality of an entire specialization because of it. And ultimately, and this is from the Roig's Avoiding Plagiarism text that's in the Canvas course, that there is this contract between you as a writer and your future reader and your reader who's reading your stuff that you have written in the past, right? Okay. And the reader assumes that you as the author or you and your author collaborators is the sole originator of the written work, and that any text or ideas borrowed from others are clearly identified by established scholarly conventions, and that the ideas conveyed are accurately represented to the best of your ability. And so that just needs to be clear. And mistakes happen. People forget to include a citation or something like that. But if it becomes a regular practice, it can suggest sloppy writing on your part or inattention, or sometimes even willful desire to not reveal where something came from, which is troubling. So the 5 simple rules to avoid plagiarism: don't copy and paste from any source without attribution. If you can, write in your own words. Again, it's better to paraphrase than to quote. When in doubt, cite. We've already covered that one multiple times, but always. Don't recycle images from your previously published work without citing them. And if you are pulling, ask permission, provide attribution to anything that you're pulling from other documents that needs to, for example, there might be a figure or some sort of picture or image that you need to give that kind of credit to, and ask permission. All right, and then I'm just going to add this real quickly because I know we're running out of time. But thinking about how you can schedule and show up at your writing time, just make sure you have adequate time to be able to do the work that you need to do in integrating evidence, doing it well, and then just practicing the craft. And we always talk about drafting quickly and editing slowly, but just a reminder, separate those out and it'll really help. Just draft it out and then go back later and make sure it's clear. It'll give you another pass through to make sure that you're not risking plagiarizing or misrepresenting something. All right, and just as a reminder, just identify how it is that you've used something, a piece of evidence, integrated it, assess its integration, see if it needs to be revised. What would you do to revise it? And then you go back and revise it on your own. All right, and so I'm going to open it up now, just at the end. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop the recording.